The morning she signed the divorce papers, Nora Callahan drove 40 minutes in the wrong direction without realizing it. She only noticed when the GPS went quiet and the road turned to gravel and the smell of salt and low tide came through the cracked window like something she'd forgotten she knew. She pulled over where the land dropped away, where the old county road surrendered to a turnaround nobody used anymore, and she sat in the car with the engine running and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at the water. The Briar Sound stretched out ahead of her, gray and wide and absolutely indifferent to the fact that her life had just been divided into two piles, and she'd walked away with the smaller one. The ferry dock below was barely visible through the November fog, just the skeleton of it. Really, the old wooden pilings half-rotted above the waterline, the covered loading platform with its collapsed roof, the iron bollards wearing rust like an old coat. A chain-link fence sagged at the top of the ramp. A handwritten sign had once said something, but the weather had taken most of the letters and left only shadows where words used to be. Nora sat there for a long time. Long enough for the engine to run hot. Long enough for the fog to shift and thicken and pull apart again. She was 34 years old. She had $41 in a checking account that still had his name on it and a debit card that she wasn't sure still worked. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Cora who was at school right now drawing pictures of horses and eating the sandwich Nora had packed at 5 that morning, because 5 was when she'd stopped pretending she could sleep. She had a 2009 Honda Civic with a crack in the passenger side mirror and 212,000 miles on it. She had a storage unit in Claremont that held everything she'd been able to carry out of the house in 4 trips while Daniel was at work, because Daniel had changed the locks on a Wednesday, and she'd found out when she came back for Cora's winter clothes and her own mother's quilt. She had the quilt. She'd gotten that much. She did not have the savings account Daniel had cleaned out the week before the papers were filed. She did not have the joint credit card, which he'd maxed and then canceled so that the debt stayed and the access didn't. She did not have the house they'd bought together 8 years ago, the one with the bay window she'd always loved and the kitchen she'd repainted twice, and the backyard where Cora had learned to ride a bike. The court would sort that out eventually, her lawyer said, but eventually was a word that didn't buy groceries or pay first and last month's rent on an apartment she hadn't found yet. She had Cora. She had the Civic. She had the quilt. And she had this view, for whatever it was worth, which right now felt like the only honest thing in her immediate vicinity. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nora had grown up 20 minutes from Briar Sound. Her grandmother had brought her to this dock twice when she was small, once to watch the summer ferry come in, once for a reason Nora couldn't remember anymore. What she remembered was the sound the boards made underfoot, that particular hollow percussion of old timber over water, and the way the whole structure seemed to breathe with the current, flexing just slightly, as if it were alive and only pretending to be still. The Heron Point Ferry had stopped running in 1987, 2 years before Nora was born. The dock had sat there ever since in the particular way that abandoned things sit, which is not really sitting at all, but slowly becoming part of what's around them. The pilings were colonized by mussels and barnacles to the height of the high tide line. The loading platform had caved in on its eastern end. The small building at the top of the ramp, which had once been the ticket office, had most of its windows gone and a door that hung at a permanent 10-degree angle. None of this was what Nora was looking at. She was looking at the water beyond it, the way the light moved on the surface, the way the sound stayed wide and quiet no matter what was happening on the shore. She was crying, she realized, though she hadn't noticed starting. The kind of crying that doesn't announce itself, that just happens while you're busy looking at something else. Her phone buzzed. A text from her lawyer. "Call me when you get a chance. Some questions about the asset list." She turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. The asset list. She knew the asset list. She'd spent 3 weeks assembling it with her lawyer at the kitchen table of her sister Meg's apartment, where she and Cora had been living for 6 weeks. 3 weeks cataloging the things she could prove were hers and the things she couldn't, the things she'd bought before the marriage and couldn't find receipts for, the things they'd bought together and which Daniel's lawyer was now characterizing very differently than Nora's lawyer was. She got out of the car. She didn't have a reason to. Her boots were not right for the terrain. She was still in the clothes she'd worn to the courthouse, dark slacks and a gray blouse and ankle boots with a heel she now regretted. She walked to the fence anyway, wrapped her fingers around the chain link, and looked down at the dock. Up close it was worse and better simultaneously. Worse because the rot was more visible, sections of decking were simply gone, leaving dark gaps where the water showed through below. Better because the bones of the thing were visible too, and the bones were not nothing. The old dock builders had known what they were doing. The main structure was white oak, the heartwood variety that doesn't rot quickly even in salt water, and even after 30-some years of neglect, the primary framing was still standing. Still standing and still square, which was more than Nora could say for various other things at the moment. She didn't know why she noticed this. She'd worked in a hardware store through her early 20s, which had given her a passing familiarity with building materials and a habit of looking at structures with mild professional interest. She was not a contractor. She was not a builder. She was a woman who had spent the last 7 years working part-time at a dental office while raising a daughter and trying to make a marriage work with a man who had apparently been moving money into a separate account for at least 2 years while telling her they were building something together. The tide was out. Below the dock, the exposed mudflat showed the lower pilings in their entirety, and she could see now what she hadn't been able to see from the car. The dock extended further than she'd thought. It hooked slightly to the north at its far end, where a secondary platform jutted out at a right angle, and this secondary platform had been built differently from the rest. The decking was plain timber rather than rough-cut planks. The joinery at the corner post was mortise and tenon, cut with precision that spoke to somebody who cared what the thing would look like, not just whether it would hold weight. A small covered structure sat at the end of that platform, tucked under a roof that had held remarkably well considering everything. A roof built with cedar shingles overlaid in a pattern that shed water more efficiently than the standard approach. Nora stood at the fence for a while longer. Then she got back in the car and drove to her sister's apartment. She didn't tell Meg about the dock. She didn't have language for it yet, and language mattered to her. She picked up Cora from school at 3:15 and made pasta for dinner on Meg's 2-burner stove, and helped Cora with a worksheet about addition, and sat on the edge of the fold-out couch after Cora was asleep and looked at the ceiling and thought about white oak and mortise and tenon joints. In the morning she called her lawyer. In the afternoon she called the county clerk's office. The Heron Point dock and the land surrounding it. A strip of waterfront running 180 feet along Briar Sound, plus a small parcel at the top of the ramp, had been in tax delinquency for 11 years. The previous owner, a real estate holding company that had gone bankrupt, had acquired it as part of a larger portfolio and then simply never done anything with it. The county had sent notices and received no response. The property had passed through the lien process and was now available at tax auction. The assessed value was listed at $12,000, which was the land value alone, assessed at a time when waterfront was still cheap in this part of the county. The structures on it were assessed at zero, meaning the county considered them a liability rather than an asset. The tax debt was $4,380, including penalties and fees. Nora had $41. She had, by the following Tuesday, $41 and a call from her brother-in-law's cousin who did estate sales and had heard, secondhand, that Nora was in a situation. The cousin offered to connect her with a woman named Patricia Voss who ran a small community lending circle for women in financial hardship, not a bank loan, not charity exactly, more like an agreement between people who understood that sometimes the difference between drowning and surviving was a few $1,000s applied at the right moment. Nora called Patricia Voss on a Thursday. Patricia Voss was in her 60s and had a voice like someone who had heard a very large number of problems without flinching. She asked 3 questions. She said she'd have an answer by Monday. On Monday, Patricia called back. The lending circle could offer Nora $4,500 at 0 interest, repayable over 3 years, on the condition that Nora could demonstrate a concrete plan for the money. Not a detailed business plan, Patricia clarified. Not a spreadsheet. Just a clear statement of what she was going to do and why she believed it would work. Nora stayed up until 2 in the morning writing it. She wrote 3 drafts, threw 2 away, and sent the third. The third one said, "I'm going to buy the Heron Point Ferry Dock at tax auction. I know it looks like nothing. I'm going to make it into something. I have a daughter and no backup plan, and I am not going to fail." Patricia called at 8 the next morning. "Welcome to the circle," she said. "We'll wire the funds Thursday." The tax auction was held online, which felt anticlimactic for what it was. Nora sat at her sister's kitchen table with Meg's laptop and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and watched the bid counter. There were two other bidders, both of whom dropped out before $4,000, apparently concluding that whatever the dock had to offer wasn't worth $4,000. Nora placed her final bid at $4,380, exactly the full amount of the tax debt, and the auction closed with no further movement. She owned a ferry dock. Or rather, she owned a derelict wooden structure in the middle of a cold November, with $112 left in her account after the auction fee, a daughter who still didn't understand why they were living at Aunt Meg's, and no plan beyond what she'd written to Patricia Voss at 2 in the morning, which had not, in the clear light of Thursday morning, been much of a plan. She drove out to the property with Cora on a Saturday, telling her daughter they were going to look at something interesting. Cora was 7 and took the world seriously, which Nora had always loved about her. She stood at the chain-link fence in her purple parka and looked at the dock with an expression that was, in its way, more honest than anything any adult had said to Nora in recent weeks. "Mom," she said, "that's really broken." "I know. Are we going to fix it?" "We're going to try." Cora thought about this for a moment. "What's under the boards that fell in?" "Water, mostly." "Is there fish?" "Probably." Cora nodded. "Okay," she said, and that was the end of her uncertainty about it. 7-year-olds, Nora had found, reserved their drama for the things that actually warranted it, and an old dock with holes in it apparently did not make the list. She spent the next 20 minutes pointing at things and asking Nora what they were called, and Nora told her piling, bollard, cap rail, tidal gauge, and Cora repeated each word carefully and stored it away. They didn't go inside the fence that first day. Nora wasn't sure the ramp was safe, and she didn't have the bolt cutters for the padlock yet. And anyway, she had wanted to see it again from the outside first, with her daughter beside her, to see whether it still looked like something or whether the daylight and the company would reveal it as the mistake everyone was about to tell her it was. It still looked like something. She couldn't have explained it precisely. The dock had a quality she associated with very old, very honest construction. The quality of having been built by someone who expected it to last, and whose expectations had been largely borne out despite decades of indifference. The ticket office at the top of the ramp had 4 walls still standing. The roof had lost several courses of shingles on the north face, but the framing beneath was intact. She could see that from the outside, the ridge line still true. The ramp itself was steep and its decking was shot, but the stringers underneath showed no visible rot. She drove back to Meg's apartment and made a list. The list was long. Bolt cutters, waterproof boots, work gloves, a good flashlight, a moisture meter if she could find one cheap, a pry bar, a notebook, a contractor-grade tarp large enough to cover the worst section of the ticket office roof. Safety rope, first aid kit, knee pads. She had $112. She went to the salvage yard on Route 9 that she'd passed 100 times and never stopped at. The man behind the counter was named Gil, and he looked at her list with the particular patience of someone who'd seen people come in with ambition and limited funds many times before and considered it more interesting than not. He found her work gloves that were used but sound. He had bolt cutters someone had traded in. He had a partial roll of contractor tarp. He charged her $38 for all of it, and threw in a pry bar he said had been sitting there too long. Her sister Meg heard about the dock the way she heard about most things in Nora's life, which was through Cora, who mentioned at dinner that Mommy had bought a broken dock with fish under it. Meg waited until Cora was asleep, and then sat across from Nora at the kitchen table with an expression Nora knew well, the expression of someone who loves you enough to say the difficult thing. "Nora," Meg said, "a dock. I know how it sounds. You have no money. You're living on my couch. You have a 7-year-old. I know. What are you going to do with the dock?" "I don't know exactly yet." Meg was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much did it cost?" $4,380. "And you have $112, give or take." Meg made a sound that was not quite a word. She got up, poured herself a glass of wine, came back to the table. "Sat down. Where is it?" "Heron Point." "The old ferry?" "Nora, that thing's been rotting since before we were born. The structure's better than it looks. You're an office receptionist. I worked at a hardware store for 4 years. That doesn't make you I know what it makes me," Nora said. "It makes me someone who understands load-bearing walls and knows the difference between surface rot and structural rot and can read a building. It's not nothing." Meg looked at her for a long time. "What does your lawyer say?" "My lawyer says focus on the divorce." "I'm focusing on the divorce and the dock. You can't afford a lawyer and a construction project." It's not a construction project yet. Right now it's an asset. Right now it's the only asset I have. Meg had no answer for that. The truth of it filled the room in the way that difficult truths do when they're stated plainly enough. The following Monday, Nora drove to the dock alone. She wore the boots and the gloves and the knee pads, and she brought the flashlight and the notebook. She cut the padlock off the gate with Gill's bolt cutters and walked down the ramp slowly, testing each plank before putting her full weight on it, the way she'd learned to move through uncertain terrain carefully, with her weight distributed, leaving herself a way back. The ticket office was 12 feet by 8 feet. The floor was concrete, poured originally and still solid, which was the first genuinely good piece of news. The walls were framed in 2x6s, not 2x4s, meaning whoever had built this had built it to take weather. 3 of the 4 window openings still had their frames. The door frame was plumb and square. The ceiling showed water damage on the north side where the roof had failed, and there was a section of floor on that side that had accumulated years of debris and moisture, but the concrete beneath it was not cracked. Nora walked to the north side and crouched down and cleared away the debris with her gloved hands, working back toward the wall. The concrete was damp but intact. She knocked on the wall at intervals with her knuckle and listened to the sound it made, the way her father had once shown her, when she was 12, when they'd bought the house in Rutland and he'd walked through it before the offer, tapping on things. A hollow sound meant trouble. A solid sound meant sound material. These walls sounded solid. She moved through the building slowly, taking notes. She cataloged what was damaged: the north-facing roof section, for window openings without glass, the door without a door, 2 interior sections of the ceiling where the substrate had failed. She cataloged what was intact: the framing, the concrete floor, 3 sections of finished wall still holding their original shiplap paneling, a built-in counter along the south wall that was not only still attached, but still level, which she checked with a small bubble level sheet found in Meg's utility drawer. The counter was not a ticket counter, she realized. It was too deep and too carefully built, with small drawers below and narrow shelving above. It looked like a ship's cabinet, the kind built for efficiency in small spaces, the kind where the joinery mattered because the sea would test it. She took photographs on her phone until the battery warned her it was at 15%. Then she climbed down the ramp and stood on what was left of the main dock platform and looked out at the sound. The water was calm. A cormorant sat on one of the outer pilings with its wings spread in that posture they use for drying, and it regarded her with the complete absence of concern that all birds at a distance have. The fog had lifted and the sound was wide and silver in the November light, and she could see the far shore, the dark tree line of the conservation land across the water, the channel markers, the small lighthouse on the point that had been automated since the 1960s. She was going to make something here. She did not know exactly what yet, but she was going to make something. She drove back and picked up Cora from school and made dinner and helped with homework and sat on the fold-out couch long after Cora was asleep and wrote in the notebook. She wrote down everything she'd seen and everything she knew and everything she needed to find out. She wrote down the name of the county building department and the name of the zoning office. She wrote down the number for the state's Small Business Development Center that she'd seen on a flyer at the library. She wrote down the measurements she'd taken of the ticket office, the load ratings she'd estimated for the ramp, the materials she'd need to get it weathertight for winter. She wrote down, "I don't know how to do this." And under it, "I'm going to do it anyway." 3 weeks later, the first person came to see what she was up to. He was not someone she'd invited. He was a man named Bob Cressy who owned the marina 2 miles north and who had, apparently, heard through the particular telegraph system of small waterfront communities that someone had bought the Heron Point property. He came on a Tuesday, drove down the gravel road in a truck that cost more than anything Nora had ever owned, and stood at the top of the ramp with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at what she was doing. What she was doing was nailing new decking to the ramp stringers using lumber she'd bought with the last of the lending circle money. She had on Meg's old Carhartt and her work gloves and her knee pads, and she was moving efficiently down the ramp with a nail gun she'd rented for the day, and she did not look up immediately when she heard the truck. Bob Cressy stood at the top for a while before he said anything. Then he said, "That's a lot of work for what you've got there." Nora drove a nail. "The ramp's the easy part," she said. "What's the hard part?" She looked up. He was 55 or so, weathered, with the particular look of someone who'd spent his working life outdoors near salt water. Not unkind, but not encouraging either. The look of someone waiting to assess whether her optimism was the useful variety or the wasteful kind. "The dock platform," she said. "Sections of it need to come out and be rebuilt. I'm going to sister the old joists where I can and replace where I can't. You know how to do that?" "I know how to do most of it. The rest I'll figure out." He was quiet for a moment. "Who's paying for materials?" She didn't answer that, because the answer was complicated. It involved a second conversation with Patricia Voss and the lending circle, who had heard about the dock through a phone call from Meg, who had apparently reversed course and made the call herself without telling Nora, a fact Nora had not yet decided how to feel about. The circle had offered a second advance, not large, $1,700 against the theory, Patricia said, that this was starting to look like something they wanted to be part of. The theory needed testing. Nora was in the middle of testing it. "I'm handling it," she said to Cressy. He looked at the ramp, at the work she'd done, at the new boards lined up straight and nailed true. He looked at the ticket office behind her where she'd installed a temporary door, a sheet of plywood cut to size and hung on hinges, enough to keep the weather out while the real work proceeded. "The Heron Point dock," he said. "I put in an inquiry on this property 4 years ago. County said it wasn't ready for sale." Nora drove another nail. "I would have offered $20,000 for it," Cressy said. She looked up again. His expression hadn't changed. Somebody at the auction should have caught that this was going to come up for sale. "My attorney was supposed to be notified." She held his gaze. "The auction was public and properly noticed." "I checked. I'm not disputing that. I'm just telling you that if you find you're in over your head on this project, I'd have an interest in discussing acquisition." "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." He nodded once and got back in his truck and drove away. Nora watched him go and then turned back to the ramp and drove 4 more nails. One for each of the things she'd wanted to say to him that she'd decided were better left unsaid. She told Meg about it that night, and Meg said, "20,000, Nora," and Nora said, "I know," and Meg said, "That would solve a lot of problems," and Nora said, "It would also mean I don't own the dock anymore," and Meg had no direct response to that. Cora heard the word 20,000 from the hallway and came in to ask what it meant, and Nora told her it was the amount of money someone had offered for the dock. And Cora said, "Are we going to sell it?" And Nora said, "No." And Cora said, "Good, because I like the fish," and went back to bed. The building inspector came in December, a woman named Ruth Park who had been doing this work for 22 years and who walked through the ticket office with the speed and certainty of someone who had no time for evasion. She noted the foundation, the framing, the roof, the windows. She wrote things in her clipboard without giving them away. Nora followed her at a respectful distance, answering questions when asked, volunteering nothing extra, which was a skill she'd been developing. At the end, Ruth Park stood in the center of the concrete floor and said, "The structure is sounder than I expected." "That's what I thought," Nora said. "You're going to need permits for anything structural. Change of use, too, depending on what you're doing." "I'm applying for permits." "Good." Ruth Park looked at her for a moment with the same assessing quality that Cressy had had, but warmer somehow, more interested. "What are you doing?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Nora said honestly. "Something public-facing. Something that uses the waterfront. I'm still working it out." Ruth Park nodded. "I'll note the existing condition for your file. Whatever you're planning, the bones will hold." She paused at the door. "The cabinetry along the south wall," she said, pointing to the built-in counter. "That's original to the structure, isn't it?" "I think so, yes." "Don't touch it. Whatever you're doing, keep that in." She left. Nora stood alone in the ticket office and looked at the cabinet along the south wall and felt something settle in her chest, the feeling not of clarity, exactly, but of something moving in the right direction. Christmas came. She spent it at Meg's, cooking the dinner with Cora sitting on the counter handing her things, the way they'd always done it. The one tradition she'd managed to carry intact from everything that had come before. Cora had asked once, carefully, in the way she asked things she'd been thinking about for a while, whether Daddy was going to have his own Christmas, and Nora had said yes, he was, and Cora had thought about that, and then asked if the fish at the dock had Christmas, and Nora had said she supposed the fish did their own version of it, which had seemed to satisfy her. Daniel called once, about a scheduling matter for the new year. His voice was the voice of someone performing normalcy at a cost he'd decided not to show. Nora kept the call to 4 minutes. In January, the divorce was finalized. She got a settlement that was partial. The courts had split the contested assets imperfectly, the way courts do, and Daniel's lawyer had been aggressive and Nora's lawyer had been stretched thin, and the number she walked out with was lower than it should have been and higher than she'd feared for a week in November. $4,200 after fees. She put $3,500 in the dock. She kept $700 in the account as the thinnest possible cushion between Cora and disaster. She hired one person. His name was Hector, and he was 18, and he had heard about the project from his uncle who'd bought lumber from the same salvage yard where Nora bought lumber. And he had showed up one Saturday in January with work boots and no particular plan except that he was looking for something to do, and the dock sounded like a thing. He had no construction experience. He had an extraordinary ability to hold a board perfectly steady while Nora worked, to anticipate what she needed next, to ask exactly the right question at the right moment, and then remember the answer. She paid him $20 a day when she had it and nothing when she didn't, which he accepted with a practicality that she found both touching and slightly alarming. They worked through January in weather that had no interest in their timeline. Rain, then sleet, then a cold snap that froze the standing water in the dock platform gaps to a thin skin of ice each morning. Nora arrived before Hector most days and stood at the top of the ramp drinking coffee from a thermos and watching the sound in the early light, which at this point she thought of as the most reliable part of her day. One morning in late January she arrived and found something she hadn't left. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was at the far end of the dock, on the secondary platform, the one with the mortise and tenon work at the corner post, the platform she'd been avoiding because of its condition. She'd been planning to assess it properly once the main dock platform was stable, but she hadn't gotten there yet. And in the meantime, she'd stayed off it because 3 of its deck boards were fully missing and 2 more were unsafe. What she found was a door. Not a visible door, not something that stood open or ajar. A door that was part of the wall of the small covered structure at the end of the secondary platform, flush with the siding, with no visible handle. She only saw it because the morning light was hitting the wall at an angle that revealed the seam, a straight vertical line, and a straight horizontal line, forming a rectangle about 3 feet wide by 4 feet tall, too precise to be a crack in the wood. She stood at the edge of the main platform and looked at it, and thought about what Ruth Park had said about the cabinetry. Don't touch it. Whatever you're doing, keep that in. Not about the secondary platform. About the cabinet. But Ruth Park had been thorough in her inspection, and Nora had been following her through the ticket office, and she was quite sure that Ruth Park had not gone to the end of the secondary platform. She went back for the safety rope and the flashlight and the pry bar. She tested every board between herself and the structure before putting her weight on it, slow and careful, the way she moved through uncertain terrain. She covered the 15 feet to the structure in about 3 minutes, which felt about right. Up close, the seams were definite. Not weathering, not settling. Cut. The rectangle was a panel, and it had been built with the same care as the rest of the secondary platform. Tight joinery, proper materials, the work of someone who intended it to last, and also intended it not to be found by anyone who wasn't looking. She ran her fingers along the right side seam and found, halfway down, a small depression in the wood. The kind of depression a finger finds naturally. She pressed it. Something moved, a small mechanism, a latch, the kind that isn't visible until you're on top of it because it was built to be invisible. The panel released. It swung outward on hinges that moved with surprising ease. They'd been maintained, she thought, or they'd been built from something that didn't corrode, bronze perhaps, because the hinges were a warm gold color where they caught the light. Beyond the panel was darkness and the smell of salt air and something else, something dry and faintly resinous, the smell of old wood in a protected space. She aimed the flashlight inside. The space was larger than the structure's exterior suggested. That was the first thing. It ran back further than it should have, deeper into the platform than the outside dimensions indicated unless, she realized, the platform itself was hollow beneath this section, a deeper crawl space than the rest of the dock. Something built deliberately into the original construction. The floor was planked in the same careful way as the rest of the secondary platform, but the planks here were tight and intact. No gaps, no rot, no water intrusion. On the right wall, hanging from wooden pegs driven into the framing, were tools. Old tools, a hand plane, 3 chisels in a leather roll, a brace drill, a draw knife. The metal had been oiled, not recently, but well enough that it had held. The leather roll had darkened, but not cracked. These were a craftsman's tools, stored by someone who knew how to store them. On the left wall, a narrow workbench ran the length of the space, and on this bench were 3 items set in a row with the precision of things that had been placed deliberately. The first was a tin box, approximately the size of a shoebox, secured with a hasp. The second was a nautical chart, rolled and tied with twine, the paper yellowed at its edges. The third was a photograph in a wooden frame, face down on the bench. Nora picked up the photograph first. She turned it over. A woman stood on the dock, the Heron Point dock, on what appeared to be a summer day. She was maybe 60 in the photograph, with white hair cut short in a way of standing that suggested she didn't care much what anyone thought of how she looked. She was smiling, not at the camera exactly, but past it, at something the photographer couldn't see. Behind her, the dock was in good repair, the loading platform still roofed, the pilings fresh with their coats of creosote. In the lower right corner of the photograph, written in ink that had faded to brown, were 4 words. She built it right. Nora stood in the hidden room under the cold January sky with the photograph in her hands and read those 4 words and felt something move through her that she didn't have a word for. Not recognition exactly, though it was close to that. Not hope, though it contained hope. Something more specific than either of those, the feeling of finding a sentence that was written for you before you knew you needed it, by someone who understood what the sentence would mean when it arrived. She put the photograph down carefully and reached for the tin box. The hasp was not locked. She opened it. Inside, folded in oilskin, were papers, documents. She lifted them out carefully and unfolded them on the workbench and held the flashlight above them and began to read. The handwriting was old but clear, the kind of handwriting that was taught as a discipline. Each letter formed with consistency, none of the later looseness that comes when penmanship stops being practiced. The top document was a letter addressed to no one in particular, dated 1979. "If you found this," she began, "you've done the hard part already. Getting in is most of it." Nora stood in the hidden space at the end of an old ferry dock in January with water moving beneath her feet and something stirring in the structure around her, and she read. The woman in the photograph was named Margaret Alden. She had owned the Heron Point dock from 1951 to 1987, which bracketed the entire operational life of the ferry. Before the ferry, she had owned a boat-building shop on the property, which she had run herself for 19 years before the county approached her about the ferry concession. She had been one of 7 women in the state who held a maritime contractor's license in the 1950s and had obtained it by taking the exam 4 times, not because she failed it, but because the licensing board, composed entirely of men, had found reasons to reject her paperwork 3 times before a lawyer friend had sent a letter that removed their options. The letter was about the dock, about what she'd built into it and why she'd hidden it, about what she'd expected might happen to the property after the ferry stopped running. Which was what had happened. It had sat and deteriorated because no one who could buy it had any interest in preserving it, and no one who might have preserved it had the money to buy it. She'd seen this coming in 1979, 8 years before the ferry stopped, and she had prepared. The remaining documents were property records, specifically, a second parcel. A small triangular piece of land at the water's edge, separate from the main dock parcel but adjacent to it, measuring approximately a 1/4 acre. It had been recorded separately in 1961, in a transaction that had not been picked up by the county's tax delinquency process 11 years ago because it was registered under a separate parcel number assigned by a predecessor county office that had used a different numbering system. Margaret Alden had owned this parcel outright. It had passed, on her death in 1991, to her daughter, who had died in 2003 without heirs and without a will, at which point it should have escheated to the state. But the parcel number issue had prevented the state from finding it. It was, as far as any current record showed, unaccounted for. Nora read the documents twice. Then she sat down on the workbench because her legs had decided they needed a rest, which they did. She sat in the hidden room of the old ferry dock with the flashlight in her lap and the papers on the bench beside her and the photograph of Margaret Alden facing her. And she thought about a woman who had built something right and hidden it carefully and written a letter to whoever would come next. The 1/4 acre at the water's edge was what Nora had been looking at from the car that first day. The section with the mortise and tenon joints and the cedar shingles. The section built differently from the rest. Margaret Alden had built that section herself, separate from the ferry infrastructure, on land she owned outright, and she had built it with the precision and care of someone leaving something for someone else. She had built a small boathouse. Below the secondary platform, accessible from the water, was a boathouse. Nora had been so focused on the dock's surface that she hadn't gone below it. She hadn't checked what was at the water's edge beneath the secondary platform because she'd been treating the dock, as a horizontal surface, as something you walked on. She hadn't thought about what might be inside it. She put the papers back in the tin box, put the tin box in the oilskin, and climbed back along the dock to the ramp, moving again with that slow-tested care. She got in the car and drove directly to the county clerk's office and asked to see the parcel records for the Heron Point waterfront. And when the clerk brought them out, Nora put Margaret Alden's documents on the counter and said, "I think there's a secondary parcel that hasn't been properly tracked." And the clerk looked at the documents and said, "Let me get my supervisor." It took 2 hours and 3 people. At the end of it, they confirmed what the documents said. The secondary parcel existed. It had not as cheat properly because of the numbering discrepancy. Its status was, legally, unclear, but the chain of title was traceable through Margaret Alden's estate, and Nora, as the owner of the adjacent primary parcel, had standing to file a claim. She drove back to Meg's apartment and sat in the car for a while before going inside. The clock on the dashboard said 4:47. Cora would be home from school. Dinner needed to happen. She sat in the car and thought about Margaret Alden standing on the dock in the summer, smiling at something past the camera, and someone behind her who saw the whole thing and wrote 4 words on the back of the photograph. She built it right. Nora went inside. She made dinner. She helped Cora with homework about fractions, which Cora found absurd, and Nora found, for the first time in months, that she was laughing at the right moments, not performing it, actually there for it, because something had shifted in the last 8 hours that she didn't have language for yet and didn't need to. After Cora was asleep, she called Patricia Voss. "I need to tell you something," she said. Patricia said, "I'm listening." Nora told her about the hidden room, about Margaret Alden, about the documents, about the secondary parcel and the boathouse beneath the secondary platform that she hadn't yet seen. Patricia was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then she said, "Tomorrow morning you're going to call a maritime attorney. Not a real estate attorney. A maritime attorney. I have a name for you. And before you call him, you're going to make 3 copies of every document in that tin box and put them in 3 different locations. Understood?" "Understood," Nora said. "Good." Patricia paused. "You were right," she said. "It is something." Nora sat with the phone after the call ended and listened to the apartment settle around her and felt the weight of the day sitting in her chest, not heavily, the way it had been sitting for months, but differently. The weight of things that were starting to take shape. The weight of a structure that was sounder than it looked. She went to the window and looked out at the dark street and thought about the boathouse at the water's edge, invisible from above, built by a woman who'd held a maritime contractor's license when the licensing board didn't want her to have one, who had built something right and hidden something carefully and left a letter for whoever came next. Nora was whoever came next. Outside, the January cold pressed against the glass. Inside, her daughter slept. And somewhere 2 miles south, the Briar Sound moved in the dark, patient and wide, keeping its particular version of a secret, waiting for the next morning, when someone would finally come to look at what was inside. The maritime attorney Patricia Voss referred her to was named Gerald Okafor, and he worked out of a 3-room office above a dry cleaner on Commerce Street in Haleford, which was the nearest town with a proper courthouse. Nora called him at 8 in the morning, which she understood was early, but Patricia had said call him, and Nora was past the point where she worried about being too much. He picked up on the second ring, which told her something. She introduced herself. He said Patricia had already texted him last night. He had a calm, methodical voice that did not make things sound smaller than they were or larger than they were, just exactly what they were, which Nora found more comforting than if he'd been warm about it. She told him everything: the parcel, the documents, the hidden room, the tin box, the secondary parcel number, and the chain of title running through Margaret Alden's estate. He asked her 4 questions and then said, "I'd like to see the documents today if that's possible. This afternoon if you can manage it." She could manage it. She dropped Cora at school, drove to Meg's apartment to collect the copies she'd made the night before at the 24-hour copy shop on Route 9, and then drove directly to Haleford. Gerald Okafor was a tall man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the desktop of a person who processed a high volume of paper with genuine care. He spread the copies in front of him and read them without speaking for 11 minutes by the clock on the wall. Then he looked up and said, "This is unusually clean for a chain of title problem. Most of the time when a parcel falls through the numbering cracks, it's a mess to reconstruct. But whoever recorded this in 1961 did the work carefully." He tapped the original deed. "Your position is defensible. More than defensible." She asked him what that meant in practical terms. "It means the secondary parcel did not properly escheat. The state's claim, if any, is weakened by the numbering discrepancy and by the fact that nobody pursued it for over 20 years after the trigger event. You have standing, you have the documents, and you have continuous physical occupancy of the adjacent primary parcel, which matters more than people expect." He took his glasses off his forehead and set them on the desk. "The question is what's in the boathouse." She told him she hadn't been inside it yet. He said, "Go find out." She drove back to the dock. The January air had the particular quality of coastal winter, cold that came with dampness, the kind that settled into clothing and held there. The chain-link fence at the top of the ramp had a padlock on it. Now she'd put it there herself 2 days ago, which felt both necessary and faintly absurd, locking a gate on property that wasn't legally hers yet to lock. She had the key in her coat pocket. She opened the gate. The boathouse was not visible from the ramp. It was not visible from the dock surface. You had to know to look below the secondary platform, which meant going down the ramp and around the north side of the dock, where a set of stone steps had been cut into the bank, not poured concrete, not lumber, actual stone, fitted together by hand with the precision of someone who understood what water could do to material over time. The steps were still solid. 30-some years of salt air and tide cycles, and they were still solid. At the base of the steps, the bank curved back under the secondary platform, and the boathouse came into view. The doors faced the water. 2 large doors, barn-style, on iron hardware that had been painted regularly enough that only the lowest 6 inches showed serious corrosion. The rest was still functional. The building itself was cedar over a timber frame, the same cedar shingles on the roof she'd noticed from above, and it sat on a foundation of granite blocks mortared and remortared over the years, sitting just above the high tide line the way something built by someone who knew tides would sit. There was a padlock on the door, old-fashioned, heavy, the kind that weighed what it was worth. She didn't have a key for this one. She stood in front of it for a moment. She thought about Margaret Alden standing in the same spot 30 or 40 years ago, padlocking something she expected to come back to and never did. She thought about her daughter's drawing of horses on the kitchen table of her sister's apartment, 30 miles north of this exact spot. She thought about Daniel's lawyer, who had sent a revised asset list that morning in which everything of any value was characterized as joint property acquired during the marriage, and everything of any liability was characterized as Nora's sole responsibility. She went back to her car and drove to the Grayshore Hardware on Route 12 and bought a bolt cutter. The woman at the register didn't ask her anything. Nora paid cash, $23, which left her with $11 and some change, and drove back to the dock. The bolt cutter took 3 attempts. The shackle was case-hardened, and she had to reposition twice before she found the angle. The lock came apart with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet of the cove, and Nora stepped back from the reflex of it, her heart loud in her ears. Then she pulled the doors open. The smell came first. Not rot, not mildew. Something else, oil and wood, and the salt and metal smell of old machinery in an enclosed space near water. The smell of something preserved rather than abandoned. The boathouse was 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. The floor was a combination of wooden decking over the water section and granite paving on the landward end. A boat slip occupied the center, currently empty, the dark water of the Sound moving slightly in the opening. And on the landward end, arranged along the walls and on heavy wooden shelving, was the reason Margaret Alden had put a case-hardened padlock on a door in 1987. Nora stood in the doorway for a long time before she stepped inside. The shelving on the north wall held tools, not the disposable tools of someone who used things once, but hand tools of a quality that was immediately apparent even to Nora's limited assessment. planes and chisels and draw knives and fitted wooden cases, each with a paper label in small, careful handwriting. Measuring tools, a set of levels and graduated sizes. On hooks above the shelving, a collection of wooden patterns and templates for boat parts, hull sections and frame templates and transom designs, each labeled with dimensions and wood species, and in some cases a small notation that read, "Tested good," with a date. The south wall held materials. Stacks of seasoned wood, primarily white oak and Douglas fir, cut to specific dimensions and stored with the careful spacing that allowed air circulation. Not scavenged lumber. Prepared stock, milled and dried, and stored for use. Above the wood, on a higher shelf, a row of bronze fittings and sealed cloth bags, cleats and gudgeons and pintles and ring bolts. The hardware of traditional wooden boat building, each piece wrapped and labeled and kept dry. At the far end, past the slip, a workbench ran the full width of the building. Above it, a pegboard held more tools, each outlined in black paint, so that the empty outline showed when something was missing, which was a system Nora had seen in serious workshops, the system of someone who used what they had and put it back. On the workbench itself, under a canvas drop cloth, something. She crossed the floor. Her ankle boots were wrong again for the surface, but she made it without incident. She lifted the canvas cloth. Beneath it, in a state of partial completion, was a boat. A small one, perhaps 16 feet, a traditional lap strake construction with the overlapping strake planks that gave wooden boats that particular texture, almost scaled, almost alive. The hull was upside down on a building jig, the frames visible from underneath, each frame bent to a curve and fastened with copper rivets that had been peened flat with the precision of someone who had done this many times. The planking was maybe 60% complete, the open sections showing the interior of the hull, the graceful curve of the bilge, the way the frames described the shape the boat would eventually take. It was unfinished. Margaret Alden had been building it when she died. Nora stood at the workbench for a long time with her hand on the gunwale, feeling the cold of the wood through her palm, feeling the way the beveled edge had been planed to a fairness that you could check with your eye and not find a hollow anywhere. She thought about a woman in her 60s or 70s working alone in this boathouse, planing edges and setting rivets and bending frames over a steam box, building something that nobody had commissioned and that nobody was waiting for, building it because it was right to build it and because she knew how. There was a logbook on the workbench beside the boat. A proper one, hardbound, with Margaret Alden's handwriting inside, not a diary, a technical record. Dimensions and materials and notes on where the planking had been difficult and what she'd done about it and what she planned to do next. The last entry was dated October 1990, for months before the ferry service ended. Planking stalled at Strake 7 port side. The white oak stock from the Carmody mill is running slightly off quarter. We'll need to select more carefully from the remaining pile. Frame 22 is tight, but fair. The transom knee came out right. The jig is holding well. And then, below the last technical note, in different ink, as if it had been added later. If I don't come back to this, whoever does, please build it right. There is enough stock. The patterns are on the wall. Take your time and build it right. Nora put the logbook down. She stood in the boathouse with the January light coming through the open doors and the sound of the sound moving in the slip below her, and she did not cry this time, which surprised her. She thought she might. But what she felt was not grief exactly. It was something else, something that sat lower in the chest and had more weight to it and was not entirely unpleasant. The feeling of having arrived at a place you didn't know you were going to. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She locked the boathouse doors with the new padlock she'd bought at Grayshore Hardware along with the bolt cutter. Then she sat on the stone steps at the base of the bank and called Gerald Okafor and told him what she'd found. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Can you describe the tools and materials to me?" She described them. He was quiet again. Then he said, "I'd like to bring someone out there with me tomorrow. A colleague who specializes in marine heritage properties. Would that be all right?" She said that would be fine. She drove back to Meg's apartment. She picked up Cora at 3:15. She made dinner pasta again, because it was what she had, and because it was fine. Cora talked about a girl at school named Jade who had a hamster named Butterscotch and who had offered to let Cora hold it at recess, which had been, in Cora's assessment, the best thing that had happened to her in recent memory. Nora listened and asked the right questions and ladled pasta into bowls and thought about a boat in a boathouse that had been waiting since 1990 for someone to come back and build it right. Gerald Okafor arrived at the dock the following morning with a woman named Constance Marsh, who was 60 or so and wore rubber boots and carried a small canvas bag and looked at the boathouse the way someone looks at a thing they've seen versions of before, but not quite like this. She spent 40 minutes inside, without speaking, while Gerald and Nora stood near the slip and watched the water. Occasionally they could hear her moving things, carefully, opening cases, running her hand along the wood stock. When she came out, she looked at Nora with an expression that was hard to read. "Do you know what that tool collection is?" she said. Nora said she had some idea. Constance said, "There are planes in there that haven't been manufactured since the 1940s. 3 of them are Matheson infill planes, Scottish-made, rosewood infill, iron blades. The 4th is a Norris A5, which is rarer than the Mathesons. On their own, those 4 planes are worth between $4,000 and $8,000 depending on the market." She said it the way you say a number that is not the main number. Nora registered this. "The timber stock," Constance continued, "is properly dried white oak and fir that has been stored correctly for at least 3 decades. White oak of that quality and preparation, properly stored, does not degrade. It gets better in some ways. For traditional wooden boat building, you cannot buy that quality new at any price because the growth rings on old-growth white oak are simply not available from current timber." She paused. "The boat under the canvas is a legitimate piece of traditional craft work. The quality of the framing is excellent. The copper riveting is correct. If someone who knew what they were doing completed it, you would have a kindly 16-foot lapstrake pulling boat of the kind that people who know about these things would very much want to buy, own, or both." Nora said, "What are we talking about, in terms of value?" Gerald said, "That's what I was hoping Constance could help us understand." Constance set her canvas bag down on the stone step. She was looking at the boathouse. "The tool collection," she said, "is worth $10,000 to $15,000 to the right buyer, meaning a working boat builder who values quality tools, not a collector, which would push it higher. The timber stock is difficult to value precisely without an inventory, but comparable stock has sold for between $20 and $40 per board foot at specialty marine lumber auctions. There appears to be several hundred board feet. The hardware is bronze, which has intrinsic value beyond its function, and the fittings appear to be from Wilcox Crittenden, which was a premium manufacturer. Most of those fittings are no longer in production." She stopped. "I would need to do a proper inventory." Nora said, "Please do." Gerald said, "There's also the question of the secondary parcel itself. Waterfront land in this part of the county has increased significantly in value over the past decade. The quarter acre at the water's edge, now that we've established the boathouse and its condition, is not assessed correctly. The county's zero valuation on structures may need to be revisited." He didn't say the number. Nora asked for it. He said, "Waterfront parcels of this size in this county have been selling at between $400,000 and $600,000 in recent years. The boathouse, if it were to be properly restored and permitted as a working marine facility," he paused, "that changes the valuation significantly." Nora sat down on the stone steps because she needed to. The number was not a number she had any relationship with. It bore no resemblance to the $41 that had been in her checking account 12 days ago, or to the $4,380 in tax debt she'd arranged to pay off through Patricia Voss's lending circle, or to the debt that Daniel had put on the joint credit card that his lawyer was now saying was jointly owned and therefore jointly owed. The number lived in a different register than her actual life. She said, "What do I need to do?" Gerald sat down beside her on the stone steps, which struck her as unexpectedly collegial. He had a legal pad. He said, "First, the secondary parcel claim needs to be filed properly. I'll handle that. Second, we need a complete inventory of the boathouse contents. Constance can do that with your permission, and it will establish the asset value for the purposes of the claim filing. Third, we need to establish what improvements you have standing to make on the primary parcel you already own, which is more straightforward." He paused and wrote something on the pad. "Fourth," he said, "and this is the part one want you to think about carefully, there is a question of whether you want to sell or whether you want to build." Nora said, "Build what?" Gerald said, "That's what you need to think about." She thought about it on the drive back to Meg's apartment. She thought about it during the 3-second windows between answering Cora's questions about Butterscotch the hamster and whether hamsters were good pets and whether they could get one. She thought about it after Cora was asleep, sitting at Meg's kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at the photographs she'd taken on her phone of the boathouse interior, the tool wall, the material shelves, the partially framed hull under the canvas. She thought about Margaret Alden writing in the logbook in 1990, something about the transom knee coming out right, and then, later, in different ink, please build it right. It wasn't instruction. It wasn't instruction the way legal documents were instructions or the way directions were instructions. It was something more like a request from one person to the next person in line, the kind of thing you say when you've built something and you know you won't be there to finish it, and you want the person who will be there to understand what it is they're finishing. Nora was not a boat builder. She was not even, technically, particularly handy. She had worked in a hardware store and could identify a mortise and tenon joint on site and knew which grades of sandpaper did what, but that was the extent of it. She could not plane an edge fair. She could not set a copper rivet. She did not have the training or the knowledge to complete the boat under the canvas. She knew she didn't have it yet. In the morning, she put Cora on the school bus and drove back to the dock. She let herself through the chain-link gate and went down the stone steps and into the boathouse. She took the logbook from the workbench and stood at the slip with the water moving below her and read it from the beginning. Margaret Alden had started building the boat in 1983. She had learned from a man named Harold Pease who had a boatyard in Eastport and who had, by Margaret's account, the patience of someone who understood that most of what you needed to know could not be said and could only be demonstrated. She had built 3 dinghies and 2 skiffs before she started on the lapstrake puller. Her notes on the previous boats were in an earlier logbook that Nora had not found yet, but the references to them in this logbook made it clear that she had not started with this boat. She had learned her way up to it. The notes were technical, but not cold. When she wrote about a difficult piece of planking, you could hear the frustration in the precision of the language, the way she'd gone back and re-beveled and refitted until it was right. When she wrote about the transom knee, I had to steam it twice, and it tried to spring back both times, and I clamped it for 3 days, and when I took the clamps off it had accepted the curve, and it was right. There was something in the writing that Nora recognized as joy. Not performed joy. The specific joy of a person who has argued with a piece of wood and won. She read for 2 hours. Then she took photographs of the logbook pages, all of them, and sent them to her own email for safekeeping, and placed the logbook back on the workbench. On her way out, she stopped at the tool wall. She looked at the planes in their fitted cases. She opened one of the cases and lifted the plane out. It was heavy, heavier than she'd expected, with the density of old iron and the particular weight of something made without compromise. The rosewood of the infill was smooth from decades of handling, slightly darker where hands had gripped it most often. She held it for a moment. She set it back in the case. She had a lot to learn. The next 2 weeks moved in layers that didn't always run at the same speed. The legal layer moved in Gerald Okafor's time, which was measured and methodical and involved a great deal of certified mail and county record searches, and one morning in the Haleford courthouse with documents, and a clerk who took nearly 3 hours to process something that Gerald had told her might take 3 hours, and which therefore took exactly 3 hours, no more. At the end of it, the secondary parcel claim was filed. It would take 60 days for the state to respond, and Gerald said he expected no challenge, given the documentation. The probability she would prevail, he said, was high, and he said high in the tone of someone who used the word carefully. There was one afternoon in that courthouse that Nora would not forget, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of what she saw while waiting for the clerk to finish processing the claim. The waiting area had a bench along one wall and a bulletin board across from it with county notices pinned to its zoning hearings, public comment periods, tax auction listings. She sat on the bench and looked at the bulletin board without reading it for a while, and then she did read it, and near the bottom, half covered by a newer notice, she found the original listing for the Heron Point Dock property, the one that had gone to auction 11 months ago and sat unclaimed for 6 of those months before she'd clicked the link on a county website in a fit of something she still didn't have the right word for. The listing said, dilapidated waterfront structure, assessed value $12,000, tax debt $4,380. Structures assessed at 0 due to deteriorated condition. She'd read those words on her laptop screen and heard, somehow, below them, not an assessment of a broken thing, but a description of what broken looked like before someone understood what was underneath. The county had seen liability. She had driven 40 minutes in the wrong direction and pulled over on a gravel shoulder and looked at the water and seen what, exactly. She still wasn't sure. Something that looked like it had been built right by someone who cared, even through the rot and the collapse. Something that had survived longer than it should have and suggested by its survival that it was worth surviving. The financial layer moved faster, not because money was simple, but because Patricia Voss moved fast when she moved. The lending circle loan that had covered the tax debt was being restructured around the boathouse inventory, which Constance Marsh had spent 4 days completing and which came out at figures that made Nora sit down several times while Constance was still reading them. The tool collection alone, by Constance's assessment, was worth between $14,000 and $18,000 to a working marine craftsperson. The timber stock, properly inventoried by species and dimension and board footage, came out at just under 400 board feet of old-growth white oak and 260 board feet of Douglas fir, at specialty marine pricing that put the total between $22,000 and $30,000. The bronze hardware, cataloged fitting by fitting, was another $8,000 to $11,000. The partial boat itself was not valued as salvage. Constance had been very clear about this. It was valued as a work in progress by an identifiable craftsperson whose other work was not unknown in the maritime community. There were 3 of Margaret Alden's completed boats in private hands, Constance had found, and their owners were known to the wooden boat world that existed, smaller than the regular world but more specific, the world of people who drove 4 hours to see a well-built wooden boat and who paid accordingly. The partial boat, Constance said, should be thought of as comparable to an unfinished painting by someone whose finished paintings were valued and sought. She wouldn't put a number on it without consulting 2 people she knew, but she didn't think the number would be small. Nora asked Gerald if any of this had any relevance to the divorce proceedings. Gerald said he was not a family law attorney. He gave her the name of one. The family law attorney was a woman named Robin Chavez who had an office in Claremont and who listened to Nora for 25 minutes without interrupting and then said, "Tell me about the timeline. When did you first become aware of this property? When did you first access it? What was the date of the separation?" Nora told her the dates. Robin Chavez wrote them down. She said, "The property was acquired after the separation date. The secondary parcel claim is being filed in your name alone. The boathouse contents were discovered by you, alone, after separation." She looked up. "Your husband's lawyer is going to try to characterize the value you've uncovered as marital assets. I'm going to argue that discovery and development of a previously unknown asset post-separation belongs to the discovering party." She said, "It's not a certainty. Nothing is a certainty, but the timing works in your favor." Nora thought about the word timing and what it meant, the specific accident of having driven in the wrong direction and pulled over where the road turned to gravel and looked at a collapsed dock in the fog on the morning she signed the divorce papers. Whether timing was the right word for that, or whether timing was just the word you used when you didn't have a better one. There was a third layer, below the legal and the financial ones, and this one moved at its own pace entirely. It moved in the evenings after Cora was asleep, when Nora took the photographs of Margaret Alden's logbook pages and read them again on her phone screen in the dark, and in the Saturday mornings when she left Cora with Meg and drove to the dock and went into the boathouse and spent time near the boat. Not touching it. Not yet. Just being near it and looking at what had been done and reading what Margaret Alden had written about how she'd done it and building, slowly, the vocabulary she would need to do what she knew she was going to do. She found the Wooden Boat School in Eastport. It had been operating for 30 years, teaching traditional wooden boat building to people who came from everywhere for the purpose, and it offered a weekend introduction course in February that had 2 spots remaining. The cost was $280. She registered for it and thought about the money for approximately 4 minutes before deciding that $280 was the right use of $280. She also found, in the back of the boathouse, behind the timber stock, a box she had missed on the first inspection. It was wooden, small, fitted together with the same precision as everything else Margaret Alden had made or kept. Inside it, wrapped in clean linen, was a second logbook, the earlier one, covering the first 3 boats. And under the logbook, a photograph of a man standing in a boatyard beside a completed lapstrake skiff, smiling, with his hand on the gunwale. On the back, in Margaret Alden's writing, Harold Pease, Eastport, 1981. He built the first one with me, so I would know how. The wooden boat school in Eastport had been founded, according to its website, by a man named Harold Pease in 1993. It was now run by his daughter, who had her father's cheekbones, and, based on the photograph on the website, his habit of standing with one hand on whatever boat was nearest. Nora stared at her phone screen for a long time. Then she put the photograph back in the box, and the box back behind the timber stock, and drove to pick up Cora from Meg's place, and took her daughter to the diner on Route 12 for lunch because it was Saturday and they were allowed to do something simply because it was good. And she ordered coffee and Cora ordered pancakes with strawberries, and they sat in a window booth, and the winter sun came in at an angle and made everything look briefly like it was made of light. She told Cora, over the pancakes, that they were going to be okay. Cora said, "I know, Mommy." Nora said, "I mean specifically okay. I mean we're going to have our own place, and you're going to have your own room." Cora was chasing a strawberry around the plate. She said, "Can I paint it?" Nora said yes. Cora said, "What color?" Nora said, "Whatever color you want." Cora thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. She said, "Orange. Like a sunset." She paused. "Is that weird?" Nora said, "No, that's exactly right." She meant it two ways, and only one of them was about the room. The hearing in the divorce proceedings was scheduled for March. Robin Chavez had filed the response to Daniel's asset characterization, citing the post-separation timeline and Nora's sole discovery and development of the dock property and its contents. Daniel's lawyer had responded by requesting documentation. Gerald Okafor had provided documentation. There was a period of several weeks during which nothing appeared to happen, but which Nora understood, from Robin Chavez, was in fact a period during which a great deal was happening in the form of lawyers reading things carefully and writing things carefully and preparing for a proceeding that both sides were beginning to understand would not be simple. Daniel called her once, in January. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail that began with, "Nora, I think we should talk," which was true in the way that many things he said were technically true and practically useless. She listened to the voicemail once and deleted it. She told Robin Chavez about it. Robin said, "Noted. Don't call him back. If he wants to communicate, his lawyer can communicate with me." Nora went to the wooden boat school in Eastport on the first weekend of February. She drove up on a Friday night and stayed in a motel that cost $68 and had a vending machine in the hallway and a view of the parking lot. And she ate dinner from the vending machine and read the last section of Margaret Alden's second logbook and went to sleep at 10 and was at the school by 8 the next morning. There were 9 other students in the weekend course. 2 of them were professional craftspeople, a furniture maker from Vermont and a carpenter from Maine who wanted to add boat work to his practice. 3 were enthusiastic amateurs with enough money to own wooden boats and enough curiosity to want to understand them better. The remaining 4 were people who, like Nora, had arrived at wooden boats by some route that wasn't entirely explicable. The instructor was a woman named Joan Pease, Harold's daughter, who wore her gray hair short and her sleeves rolled up, and who demonstrated things with the calm authority of someone who had done them so many times that the difficulty had long since merged into the motion itself. She could plane an edge fair in less than a minute, and she did it in front of the class without comment, just showing them the angle of the blade and the direction of the grain, and the sound the plane made when it was working right versus when it wasn't. And then she handed the plane to the nearest student and said, "Your turn." Nora held the plane and thought about the Matheson plane in its fitted case in the boathouse at Heron Point, the way it had felt in her hand, the weight of it. She set the blade to the edge of the practice board and pushed. The plane chattered, skipped, took too much. Joan came to stand beside her and said, "You're holding your breath. Breathe. Let the tool do the work." Nora breathed. The plane ran smooth. It was such a small thing. The difference between holding your breath and not holding your breath. The difference between fighting the tool and letting it do the thing it was built to do. She went over the board 3 more times, and each time it was better, not because she was better, but because she had stopped interfering with something that already knew how to work. She thought, standing there at the bench with shavings curling off the wood and the smell of cut oak in the cold workshop air, that this was something she had not known she needed to learn. Not the planing specifically, the other thing, the stopping interfering. She had been interfering with things for a long time, managing the situation, managing her face, managing Cora's fear and Meg's worry and her lawyer's advice and her own panic, managing everything, because if you stopped managing it all fell. That was what she had believed. And here was Joan Pease telling her to breathe and let the tool do the work, and the tool did the work, and nothing fell. At lunch on the second day, she told Joan Pease about the boathouse, about Margaret Alden and the unfinished boat, about finding the photograph of Harold Pease in the box behind the timber stock. Joan was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know Margaret Alden's work. Dad talked about her for years. He said she was the best student he ever had, not meaning the fastest, meaning the most honest. She never cut corners. She never convinced herself something was good enough when it wasn't." He was sad when she stopped building. Nora said, "She didn't stop. She just didn't finish." Joan looked at her. "The boat is still there?" Nora took out her phone and showed her the photographs. Joan looked at each one without speaking. She looked at the tool wall and the timber stock and the partially framed hull. She looked at the photograph of the logbook page with Margaret's last entry. She said, "Please build it right." Nora said, "Yes." Joan looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "How much have you done before?" Nora said, "I planed an edge this morning. That's the extent of it." Joan said, "Come back in April. We have a 3-week course. By the end of it, you'll know enough to know what you're doing and enough to know what you don't know yet. And those are the 2 things you need." Nora said, "How much is the 3-week course?" Joan told her. Nora did the math. It was possible. It was a different kind of possible than it had been 2 months ago, when possible and impossible were nearly synonymous. But it was possible. She said, "I'll come back in April." She drove home on Sunday afternoon through a coastal February that was gray and flat and not unpleasant. The sound was visible from the highway for a stretch, and she looked at it the way you look at a thing that has become familiar, not without interest, but without the particular quality of attention you gave it before it was yours. Cora had spent the weekend with Meg and had, according to the text thread, visited Jade's house and held Butterscotch the hamster twice and declared that hamsters were better than she'd expected. When Nora arrived at Meg's apartment, Cora was at the kitchen table drawing, which was what she did when she was content, filling page after page with horses and houses and occasionally a boat, which was new. Nora looked at the boats. She said, "Where are those from?" Cora said, "You talk about boats." Nora said, "Do I?" Cora said, "Yes. You say the word boat a lot now." Nora sat down across from her daughter and looked at the drawing. It was a recognizable boat lap straight construction, the overlapping planks visible even in the crayon rendering, the proportions not far off from the hull under the canvas in the boathouse. 7 years old and drawing what she'd heard her mother talking about, filling in the shape of something that existed but that she hadn't seen. Nora said, "I'll take you to see it sometime." "The real one." Cora said, "The one that's not finished?" Nora said, "The one that's going to be." She took the drawing home. She put it on the wall of the small room in Meg's apartment that she and Cora shared, next to the copy she'd made of Margaret Alden's last logbook entry. She looked at them together for a moment, the child's drawing of the boat and the old woman's handwriting about the boat and the decade and the life that sat between them. She was learning something about the nature of inheritance. Not the legal kind. Not the kind Robin Chavez and Gerald Okafor were managing through certified mail and county filings and court appearances. The other kind. The kind where someone builds something carefully and leaves it for a person they can't know yet, and the person they can't know shows up eventually, because that's how things work when they're built right. Margaret Alden had not left her the boat or the tools or the timber or the land. She had left her a set of conditions under which something was possible. The rest was Nora's to do. It was late February when the letter came. Not from Gerald or Robin or Patricia Voss. Not from the county clerk. Not from the state agency that was processing the secondary parcel claim. It came from a woman in Connecticut named Louise Alden Croft, who was 83 years old and who was, her letter explained, the niece of Margaret Alden. The only surviving blood relative, as far as she knew. She had seen a brief mention in a local paper, a small item, the kind that ran in the county paper when something unusual came before the clerk's office about a secondary parcel claim at Heron Point. She had recognized the name of the dock. She wrote, in a handwriting that was careful and somewhat effortful, "I did not know about the secondary parcel or the boathouse. My aunt never spoke of it. She was a private woman about her work. I have no claim to make and no interest in complicating what you are doing. I only wanted to write because I saw the name, and I thought someone should know that Margaret Alden was one of the best people I have ever known, and that she built boats the way other people build cathedrals, meaning as though they were going to last, meaning as though someone else would need them, meaning as though the work itself was the point and not whatever came after. I hope whatever you are doing with the place is right for it. Nora read the letter 3 times. Then she wrote back, by hand, on paper, which she had not done in years. She told Louise Aldencroft what she had found and what she intended. She described the boat under the canvas and the logbook and the tool wall and the timber stock. She described what Joan Pease had said about Margaret. She said, "I am going to learn enough to finish the boat, and when I do I will send you a photograph." Louise Aldencroft wrote back within a week. Her letter contained 2 things, a reply that said, "Good, I'm glad," and a photograph. A different photograph from the one in the box. This one showed Margaret Alden at a workbench, not the Heron Point boathouse, somewhere with different light, planing an edge, not looking at the camera, fully absorbed in the work. In the photograph, she was perhaps 50 years old, and she was entirely somewhere else, not elsewhere, not distracted, but somewhere inside the work, in the particular place that skilled physical labor takes you when you stop managing it and start simply doing it. On the back, in Louise Aldencroft's careful handwriting, Margaret at Pease's Yard, Eastport, 1982. She drove 2 hours each way for 3 years to learn to do it right. Nora pinned it to the wall next to Cora's drawing. March came. The hearing in the divorce proceedings lasted most of a day. Robin Chavez had been right that it would not be simple. Daniel's lawyer argued for 2 hours about the dock property and the boathouse assets. Robin Chavez argued for 2 hours about post-separation discovery and development and the specific timeline of when Nora had first accessed the property and what she had found there and what she had done with it. The judge asked a series of questions that suggested she was reading the documents carefully and drawing her own conclusions, which Robin Chavez had said was the best thing you could hope for. The ruling came 2 weeks later. The dock parcel, acquired in Nora's name alone with funds from a lending circle not accessible to Daniel, was found to be her separate property. The contents of the boathouse, discovered and inventoried post-separation, were found to be her separate property. The secondary parcel, once the state claim resolved, would be her separate property. The joint debt on the credit card the debt Daniel had created was found to be jointly owed, but with Daniel bearing primary liability, given the documented circumstances of how it was incurred. The joint house, the one with the bay window and the kitchen she'd repainted twice, would be sold and the proceeds divided. Nora's share of the proceeds, combined with what the legal resolution had established as her assets, meant that for the first time since the September morning when she'd found the locks changed, the number in her accounting was not a liability. She did not hear the ruling in a courtroom, standing in formal clothes with her lawyer beside her. She heard it over the phone, from Robin Chavez, in 3 sentences, calmly delivered. And then she sat for a while on the stone steps of the dock with the phone in her lap and thought about $11 and some change, which was what she'd had left after buying the bolt cutter. About the $41 that had been in her account the morning she drove in the wrong direction and ended up here. About Daniel's lawyer's revised asset list, which had been so precisely designed to reduce her to nothing that it had, in its precision, revealed exactly what kind of mind had produced it, one that calculated rather than built, that subtracted rather than added, that saw the world as a ledger to be manipulated rather than a thing to be made. She thought about all the ways she had believed, over the past year, that she was the problem, that the marriage had failed because she was insufficient, that the account had been drained because she had not paid close enough attention, that the locks had been changed because she was, in some fundamental way that she couldn't articulate, the kind of person to whom locks got changed. She had carried this the way you carry something that has no particular weight of its own, but that you've held so long the muscles have adapted and you've forgotten what it felt like before. She set the phone on the step beside her and looked at the water. She was sitting on the stone steps at the base of the bank with the boathouse doors open behind her and the sound spreading out in front of her, and Gerald Okafor was inside with a contractor she'd asked him to bring, a woman who specialized in historic waterfront structures and who was assessing what the boathouse needed to be made fully functional again. Robin said, "It went well." Nora said, "I know." Robin said, "How do you know?" Nora said, "I could tell from how the judge asked the questions." Robin said, "You're right. That is how you tell." She paused. Congratulations. Go build something. The contractor came out of the boathouse and stood at the top of the steps with a clipboard and the particular expression of someone who has found a structure in better condition than expected. She said, the foundation is sound. The framing is original cedar, no significant rot. The sections I'd flag are two of the door frames and a section of decking near the north wall. She flipped a page on the clipboard. The roof is the most urgent. You'll want to re-shingle within the year to preserve what's underneath. But the bones are right. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Nora said, yes. She looked at the contractor's clipboard without really reading it. She was looking past it, at the boathouse and beyond it, at the sound and the late March light on the water, the way the light was doing the thing it did in early spring, coming in lower and warmer than you expected. She thought about Cora's question at the diner. What color? Orange, Cora had said. Like a sunset. And then, is that weird? No, Nora had said. That's exactly right. Robin Chavez called to tell her the ruling was official and filed. Nora was standing at the boathouse doors when her phone rang, looking at the sound the way she had looked at it that first morning from the gravel shoulder of the county road, except that it was different now not because the water had changed, but because she had. The gray November of that first morning had given way to late March, and the light was doing something to the water that November light couldn't do, turning the surface into something that moved between silver and blue and a color she didn't have a word for, the color of things that were about to become themselves. She listened to Robin's 3 sentences. She said thank you. She put the phone back in her coat pocket and stood in the doorway for a moment. And then she walked into the boathouse and sat on the workbench beside the unfinished boat and put her hand on the hull the way she'd put her hand on it that first day flat-palmed, feeling the temperature of the wood, the beveled edge of the plank, the cold. 30-some years, this boat had been waiting. Margaret Alden had bent these frames and set these rivets and planed these planks to fairness and then stopped, not because she wanted to, but because something in the chain of her life had broken and she hadn't been able to come back, and the boat had sat in the dark on its building jig with the copper rivets peened flat and the lower strakes fitted and the upper half waiting. And it had waited with the patience of something that knew it was built right and was therefore not afraid of time. Nora was not a boat builder. She was going to learn. She drove back to Meg's apartment and made dinner and helped Cora with a school project about the solar system, which required cutting circles of varying sizes from colored paper and labeling them and arranging them in order. And Cora was very particular about which shade of red was right for Mars, and Nora cut 3 versions before Cora accepted the third one. And they worked at Meg's kitchen table under the overhead light with scissors and glue sticks and the particular focused contentment of making something that had a right answer you could check. After Cora was asleep, Nora sat at the table and wrote a list. She had always made lists, not the anxious kind, not the kind you make when you're trying to control something that won't be controlled, but the working kind, the kind that takes the shape of a thing and puts it in a sequence you can follow. The list was not long. Find a place to live. Complete the April course at Eastport. Begin work on the boathouse restoration. File the secondary parcel paperwork as it matured. Learn to build the boat. She looked at the list for a while. Then she wrote one more line at the bottom, not a task exactly, more like a direction. Build it right. She put the list in her coat pocket and went to bed. The apartment came first because Cora needed a room of her own and because Nora had been sleeping on a fold-out couch in her sister's living room for 5 months and Meg had been generous and patient, and it was time. The settlement from the joint house hadn't come through, yet it would take another month for the sale to process, but between the lending circle restructuring and a small advance that Gerald Okafor had helped her arrange against the boathouse asset inventory, she had enough for a deposit and 2 months' rent on a place that would hold them while the rest sorted out. She found it the first week of April. A rental on Whitmore Street in Grayshore, 8 minutes from the dock, the ground floor of a Victorian that had been divided years ago into 2 apartments. The upstairs tenant was an elderly man named Arthur Weeks who grew tomatoes on the shared back porch in summer and who, when Nora came to look at the apartment, was sitting on the porch in a cardigan reading a paperback and nodded at her with the mild acknowledgement of a person who had decided long ago not to trouble himself about things that weren't his business. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. One of them got afternoon light. Cora stood in the doorway of that room and looked at the walls, which were white, and at the window, which looked out on a small yard where a dogwood tree was starting its spring business, and she said, orange. Like we said, Nora said, like we said. They moved in on a Saturday with Meg's help and the help of 2 women from Patricia Voss's lending circle who showed up with a truck in a matter-of-fact efficiency that required no explanation and expected no special thanks. Just the recognition that this was something worth doing, and they were there to do it. By 4 in the afternoon, the apartment had furniture not much, a bed for each of them and a table and a couch from a secondhand store in Haleford, and the quilt that had been Nora's mother's, spread on Nora's bed in the room with the morning light. Cora's room got painted that weekend. The orange she'd chosen was not the orange of construction cones or cheap Halloween decorations, but something warmer, closer to the orange of late afternoon sun through leaves, and on the walls of a room with afternoon light, it looked exactly as right as Cora had known it would. Nora painted it and Cora supervised from the doorway, sitting on the floor with her back against the frame, offering commentary that was specific and occasionally conflicting, but always confident. When it was done, they stood in the room together, and Cora said, "Yes, just yes. No qualifications, no further commentary." The settled sound of a thing that had been decided and had come out right. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nora drove to Eastport the 3rd week of April for the 3-week course. She left Cora with Meg, who had already planned it with the calm coordination of a sister who had watched someone she loved rebuild from the ground up and understood what the rebuilding required. Cora was philosophical about 3 weeks. She had Jade and Butterscotch the hamster and a school project about ocean animals that she was genuinely excited about, and she and Nora talked every evening on the phone, and Nora described what she had learned that day, and Cora described what Butterscotch had done, and this was a satisfactory exchange for both of them. The Eastport Wooden Boat School occupied a building on the harbor that had started its life as a working boathouse and been adapted over the years with the additions and modifications of an institution that grew faster than it planned. There was always something slightly unfinished about it: a new bench not yet oiled, a storage area that had been reorganized and not quite completed, but the working spaces were meticulous in the way working spaces are when the people who use them are serious. The smell of the place settled into Nora's clothes by the 2nd day, sawdust and linseed oil, and the faint maritime smell that came through the walls from the harbor outside. Joan Pease ran the 3-week course with 2 assistants, a young man named Derek who had been building boats since he was 14, and a woman named Sarah whose specialty was oar-making and who could speak for 30 minutes about wood selection for or blanks without losing anyone in the room, because the specificity of what she knew was compelling rather than technical in the deadening way. You understood, listening to Sarah talk about grain direction in Sitka spruce, that there were entire worlds inside the knowledge of how things were made, worlds you could spend a life in without reaching the edges. The course was not gentle, but it was not unkind. Joan believed in showing a thing once and letting you fail at it, and then showing it again and letting you get closer, and then leaving you alone to find your own way to doing it right. Because the right way was not one way exactly, but a convergence that happened between the material and the tool and the person using the tool, and you could not shortcut that convergence by being told about it. You had to arrive at it. Nora failed at things in that 3 weeks. She split a plank on the 3rd day by pushing too hard into the grain. She set a rivet crooked and had to drill it out, which took 40 minutes and the kind of patience she wasn't sure she had until she found she did. She bent a frame that she'd steamed too long, and it lost its spring, and Derek showed her how to test the wood's readiness, and she understood it not from the test itself, but from the sound the steam-softened oak made when it was right versus when it had gone past right, a difference of perhaps 90 seconds that mattered completely. She got better. Not fast, and not uniformly. She had good days and days when nothing worked, and the difference between them was not always explainable except that on the bad days, she was usually in some way thinking about what she was doing rather than doing it, watching herself rather than being in it. Joan told her, on the 2nd week, that the obstacle for most new builders was not skill, which was learnable, but self-consciousness, which was the enemy of touch, and touch was what the work required. You had to stop being a person who was learning to build a boat and start being a person who was building a boat. The distinction was not small. By the 3rd week, something had shifted. Nora couldn't name the moment it happened. She was fitting a strake plank to a frame in the afternoon light of the workshop, beveling the lower edge with a block plane to match the curve of the frame, and she stopped thinking about the bevel and the plane and the angle of the cut, and simply felt when it was right. The slight give of resistance that meant the tool was working with the wood rather than against it. The sound the shaving made coming off the blade. She ran the plank against the frame. It seated. No gap. She held it for a moment and said nothing. And Joan came to look and said nothing either. And that nothing was the right response to a thing that didn't need words. On the last day of the course, Joan asked the class what they were going to build. Some people had plans they'd arrived with. Others had developed them over the 3 weeks. When she got to Nora, Joan already knew the answer, but she asked anyway. Nora said, "I'm going to finish the boat Margaret Alden started." Joan said, "Yes, you are." She said it the way you say a thing that has already happened, that you are only now saying out loud. The drive home from Eastport took 2 hours through the coastal spring that was by now fully committed to itself. The roadside trees in full leaf, the light extended and generous. The quality of the air carrying the particular softness that comes after the cold has genuinely relented. Nora drove with the window down. She thought about the 3 weeks and what she had in her hands now that she hadn't had before. Not mastery, not even close, but the beginning of something, the earliest form of knowing that grew into knowing more, and then more still, the way a frame described the shape a boat would take before there was yet any planking to fill it in. She thought about Cora's orange room and the dogwood in the yard at Whitmore Street and the tool wall in the boathouse and the photograph of Margaret Alden absorbed in her work at a bench in Eastport, not looking at the camera. She thought about Joan P.'s saying "yes, you are," the way you say a thing that has already happened. May arrived and Nora began working on the boathouse restoration in the mornings, when Cora was at school, and on the boat in the afternoons. The restoration contractor the woman Gerald had brought, whose name was Helen Park and who had the calm authority of someone who had been dealing with people's feelings about their structures for 20 years, had given her a prioritized list. Roof first, then the door frames, then the north wall decking section, then cosmetic work. Nora worked through the list in order. She hired a roofer for the shingles, because roofing required scaffolding she didn't have and a pace she couldn't match alone. And she watched the roofer work the first day so that she understood what was being done and why and could verify that it was being done right. This was something Margaret Alden would have done, she thought, not as distrust of the roofer, but as the habit of someone who believed in understanding the work. The door frames she did herself, with Joan's voice in her head about touch, and with the set of chisels from the tool wall that she had, after long consideration, allowed herself to begin using. Not all the tools. Not yet. The planes were for the boat. But the chisels were right for the door frames, and she used them with the care she'd been taught, keeping the edges sharp on the Japanese water stones she'd found in a fitted case on the lower shelf, stones that had been used and maintained and were still, after 30 years, perfectly flat. Patricia Voss came to see the boathouse in May. She drove out on a Tuesday afternoon with no particular announcement, which was Patricia's way. She said she didn't like scheduled visits because scheduled visits were for things people weren't sure about, and she was sure about this, so she just came. She stood in the boathouse for a long time looking at everything. She looked at the tool wall and the timber stock and the bronze hardware on the shelves and the partially framed hull on its building jig, which had new planking now, 2 more strakes fitted and riveted since Nora had come back from Eastport. She said, "I've been doing this for 19 years and I've seen a lot of women walk into a lot of different situations." She paused. "I have not seen one like this." Nora said, "I don't know exactly what this is yet." Patricia said, "Yes, you do. You're just not saying it out loud." She turned and looked at the sound through the open doors, at the water doing its late afternoon thing. She said, "I wanted to ask you something." The lending circle has a question that comes up sometimes with women who find themselves in positions like this one. The question is whether to sell what they've found and take the security of the money, or whether to build on it. She let the question sit for a moment. "I know what the money looks like," Nora said. "Gerald and Constance put numbers on it." Patricia said, "The numbers are not small." Nora said, "I know." Patricia said, and Nora looked at the boat. She said, "If I sell the tools and the timber and the hardware and the partial boat to whoever pays the most for them, I end up with money that I spend on the life I have. And in 10 years the tools are in someone else's workshop and the timber is in someone else's boat and Margaret Alden's name is nowhere." Patricia said nothing, which was her way of waiting. Nora said, "If I complete the boat and sell it, the sale price is different from the parts. And what I know how to do is different after I've done it than before." Patricia said, "And the secondary parcel." The state had responded to the claim 2 weeks before. Gerald had called to tell her no challenge, claim approved, parcel transferred. A quarter-acre of waterfront in Nora's name, with a functioning boathouse on it that was now half restored and would be fully restored by summer. She had stood in the apartment on Whitmore Street when Gerald told her and had not known what to do with her hands and had eventually put them flat on the kitchen table and looked at them. She said, "The secondary parcel plus the dock parcel is 240 feet of waterfront. Helen Park thinks the boathouse could be permitted as a working marine facility. A legitimate boat shop with the right permits and the right setup." Patricia said, "A boat shop." Nora said, "There's a market for traditional wooden boat work. Joan Pease's school fills every course they offer. The people who come to that school want to own wooden boats, and the people who own wooden boats need someone to maintain them. It's not a large market, but it's a real one, and it's not well served in this part of the coast." She had researched this. She had spent several evenings while Cora slept reading wooden boat forums and talking to Joan over email and looking at what marine workshops were charging for traditional repair work and what the waiting times were at the few places that did it. The waiting times were long. The prices were high. The market was not saturated. She said, "I'm not talking about building a business tomorrow. I'm talking about a direction." Patricia looked at her for a long time. She had a way of looking at people that was not assessment, exactly not the look of someone deciding, but the look of someone who had already decided and was taking a moment to be sure the other person had caught up. She said, "The Lending Circle has a small business development fund. We don't use it often. Most of the women who come to us need stability first and time before they're ready to think about what comes after." She paused. "You're not like most of the women who come to us." Nora said, "I'm exactly like them. I just have a boathouse." Patricia almost smiled. She said, "I'll bring it to the group." She left. Nora stood at the boathouse doors for a while in the late afternoon light and thought about direction and what it felt like to have one after months of only having the next immediate thing, only the next step visible from where she stood. The step after that and the one after that and the one after that, assembling themselves into something she could now see from further away. A shape. The way a boat's shape exists in the frames before there is any planking, the curve already determined, the form already committed to, waiting only for the time and the hands to fill it in. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Cora came to the boathouse for the first time on a Saturday in June, on a morning when the sound was doing its best impression of a painting, flat and lit, and almost too still, the kind of morning that made you slow down on the way from the car, because something about the air demanded it. Nora had not rushed this. She had been working at the boathouse for 2 months, and she had let Cora know about it in stages: the dock, the stone steps, the general shape of what was there, and she had waited until she was ready herself to share the specific interior of it, the specific weight of what was in it. Some things needed to be yours for a while before they could be given to someone else, even someone you loved. Maybe especially then. Cora came down the stone steps holding Nora's hand, stepping carefully, counting the steps under her breath, 11 of them, she announced at the bottom. They went to the boathouse doors and Nora opened them, and the morning light came in from both directions, from the open doors and from the 2 windows in the north wall that Helen Park's carpenter had reglazed in May, and the interior of the boathouse was bright in a way it hadn't been since Margaret Alden closed it. Cora stood in the doorway and looked at everything. She looked at the tool wall, the planes and chisels in their cases, the wooden patterns on their hooks. She looked at the timber stock on the south wall and the bronze fittings in their cloth bags. She looked at the boat on the building jig, which now had 11 of its 16 strakes fitted, the hull taking its shape fully. Now you could see clearly what it was going to be, the graceful curve of the lap strake sides, the way the bow rose with the particular eagerness of a well-designed wooden boat, a shape that looked like it wanted to move. Cora said, "That's a boat." Nora said, "Yes." Cora said, "Did you make it?" Nora said, "I'm finishing it. Someone else started it a long time ago and didn't get to come back." She crouched down to Cora's level. Her name was Margaret. She was very good at this. She left all of this for whoever came next. Cora considered this. She said, "And you're whoever came next." Nora said, "I'm whoever came next." Cora walked slowly into the boathouse. The way she walked into things she was taking seriously, her small sneakers deliberate on the planked floor. She went to the building jig and stood beside the hull and reached out and put her hand on it, flat-palmed, the same way Nora had done that first day. She said, "It's cold." Nora said, "It'll warm up as the day gets going." Cora moved her hand along the plank, following the overlap of the strake, feeling the bevel of the edge. She looked up at Nora. "Can I help?" Nora said, "Not with the rivets yet. But there are other things." She showed Cora the cleaning rags and the boiled linseed oil she'd been using on the old tool cases, working it into the wood to replace what the decades had pulled out. She showed her how much oil to use and how to work it in with the grain. Cora sat on the floor beside the lowest shelf for the next hour and oiled every tool case she could reach, thoroughly and without rushing, with the concentration of a person who has been given a real job and intends to do it right. Nora worked on the boat above her, and they talked in the way that people who are both occupied talk, not continuously, but in the natural intervals of work, things offered and received without the pressure of sustained conversation. At one point, Cora asked about the patterns on the wall, the wooden templates for hull sections and frame curves, each one labeled in Margaret Alden's small, careful handwriting, and Nora climbed down from the boat and took one from its hook and showed Cora how the curve of the template matched the curve of the frame on the boat, how Margaret had built the patterns from her designs so that every frame could be checked against the intended shape and any deviation caught before it was locked in. Cora held the pattern and bent to look at the frame, moving her eyes between them. She said, "They're the same." Nora said, "That's what right looks like, when what you made matches what you meant." Cora hung the pattern carefully back on its hook, making sure the label faced out, which was how they had all been hung. Nora had not told her to do this. She had simply looked at how the others were hung and done it the same way. That was the moment, not dramatic and not marked by anything except the small click of the wooden pattern settling back against the wall, when Nora understood that this place was going to be part of her daughter's growing up in a way she hadn't entirely planned for, but that was right. Cora said, at one point, "Who was Daniel?" Nora did not stop working. She said, "Someone I was married to. Someone who made some choices that weren't good." Cora said, "Do you miss him?" Nora thought about this honestly. She said, "I miss what I thought it was going to be. That's different from missing him." Cora absorbed this. She oiled the corner of a tool case. She said, "I don't miss him. I'm sorry if that's bad." Nora said, "It's not bad. People feel what they feel." Cora said, "I like it here. The dock and the boat and our apartment. I like it better." She said it with the matter-of-fact clarity of a child who has not yet learned to hedge her preferences for other people's comfort, who says the true thing because it is the true thing. Nora felt it move through her chest the way true things moved through her chest, with a weight that was not heavy but was not nothing. She said, "Me too." The boat was finished in August. Not by Nora alone. Joan Pease drove down for a weekend in July and spent 2 days going over the upper strakes with her, the sections that required the tightest fitting, and their work together those 2 days had the quality of a good collaboration, two people with different amounts of experience working on the same problem and arriving at solutions that neither would have found alone. Joan was generous with what she knew. She corrected without condescending and praised without flattering, and when she left she said, "You'll be fine," and meant the specific technical thing and possibly also the larger thing. Derek, the young man from the boat school, came for a week in August to help fit the thwarts and the floorboards and to do the caulking, which was its own specialty and which Nora had decided she needed another set of experienced hands for on the first boat. She would learn to caulk on the next one. The next one. The boat came off the building jig on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of August. Nora and Derek and Helen Parks Carpenter, who had come by out of curiosity and turned out to be useful with the jig mechanism, lifted it slowly and turned it right side up and set it on padded sawhorses. They stood back and looked at it. It was 16 feet long with a beam of 54 inches, white oak frames and strakes, Douglas fir thwarts and floorboards, bronze fittings throughout. The planking had been done in 2 woods, the lower strakes in Margaret Alden's original white oak from the 1980s stock, and the upper strakes in new white oak that Nora had sourced from a small mill in Maine that still cut old-growth quality timber for traditional boat work, the grain tight, and the color slightly different, a difference that would fade over time as the wood aged and the surface treatment evened them out. The hull was the particular shape of a Margaret Alden design, which Nora had come to recognize over the months of working with it, a shape that was conservative rather than showy, that valued seakeeping over elegance, but that had, in its conservatism, its own elegance, the kind that comes from something designed without compromise for a specific purpose. Nora put her hand on the stem. The fit was right. The whole thing was right in the way that things built with care and honesty and enough time are right, not in the way of perfection, which was not what right meant, but in the way of a thing that knew what it was and had been built to be exactly that and nothing else. Derek said, "It's good." He had seen a lot of boats. He said it like the fact it was. Nora drove to Eastport that afternoon not for the school, just to tell Joan. She had called ahead and Joan met her at the harbor, and they sat on a dock bench and Nora told her about the morning, about lifting the boat off the jig, about the fit of the stem. Joan listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. She said, "Are you going to sell it?" Nora said, "Yes." Joan said, "Do you know where?" Nora said, "Constance Marsh knows a buyer in Maine who collects Margaret Alden's work. He's been looking for a completed piece for 2 years. When Constance told him there was an unfinished hull and that someone had finished it, he was interested." Joan said, "He's going to want to know about you. The person who finished it." Nora said, "I know." She had thought about this. She had thought about what it meant for someone to buy a completed Margaret Alden boat, knowing that the completion had been done by a woman who had learned to build boats 11 months ago on the foundation of 3 weeks of formal instruction and a logbook left in a tin box. It mattered. The provenance mattered. She had decided to be completely honest about it and let the buyer decide. Constance arranged the visit in September. The buyer's name was William Rafferty, and he drove down from Maine on a Saturday morning with a woman Nora understood to be his wife. Though no one introduced her that way, she was simply there, looking at things with the same intelligent attention he had. He was in his 60s, white-haired, with the kind of bearing that came from a life spent outdoors rather than from any effort at impression. He looked at the boat for a long time before he said anything. He asked Nora to walk him through what was original and what she'd added. She did, strake by strake, fitting by fitting, explaining the upper strake stock she'd sourced and why, explaining where she'd consulted Joan Pease and where she'd worked alone, explaining the caulking she hadn't done herself and that Derek had done and why she'd made that choice. He asked her about the building jig, whether it had been Margaret Alden's. She said yes, it was in the boathouse. She hadn't touched it. He said, "I'd like to see the boathouse." She took him down the stone steps. He stood in the doorway for a long time, the way people who understood what they were looking at stood in the doorway. He went to the tool wall and looked at the planes in their cases without touching them. He went to the timber stock and looked at the remaining white oak, touching the end grain gently with one finger. He stood at the workbench and looked at the logbook, which was still there, and Nora said he could read it if he wanted to, and he opened it and read the first page and the last page and closed it. His wife had come to stand beside him. She put her hand briefly on the logbook and took it away. He said, "I'll buy the boat." He named a price. The price was not the number Gerald and Constance had speculated it might be. It was higher. Nora looked at him. She said, "That's more than I expected." He said, "The work is right. The provenance is honest. And finishing another builder's work without claiming it as your own is not something most people would do." He paused. Margaret Alden would have recognized it. He said it the way you say a thing that is meant as the serious compliment it is. They settled on the price that afternoon. William Rafferty arranged to have the boat collected the following week by a trailer service he used. Before he left, he stopped at the boathouse doors and looked at the sound, the September light on the water, the particular quality of the afternoon. He said, "What are you going to build next?" Nora said, "I have a commission inquiry. A man in Connecticut who has a lapstrake dinghy that needs significant structural work, new frames, replanking in several sections. He found me through Constance." Rafferty said, "Repair work is where you learn to build. Every boat someone else built tells you something you wouldn't have found in your own." He left. Nora stood on the stone steps after his car had gone, with the sound moving below her and the boathouse at her back, and she let the afternoon be what it was for a few minutes before she had to pick up Cora from school. In October, the month Cora turned 8, Nora applied for the marine facility permit. She had been working with Helen Park on the structural requirements since summer, and the boathouse now met the specifications for a licensed working marine workshop: the right floor load ratings, the right ventilation, the proper electrical for shop tools, a water connection at the slip for launching and recovery. The permit process would take several months. Gerald said it was not complicated, just thorough, which was how permits should be. Patricia Voss's lending circle approved the Small Business Development Fund in October as well. Not a large amount, but enough for the equipment Nora needed to work professionally rather than at the level of a well-equipped hobbyist. A proper bandsaw for ripping stock, a thickness planer, a steam box of the right size, a set of clamps sufficient to hold a full hull section. She bought secondhand where she could and knew where she couldn't. And she set up the shop over 2 weekends in November with Cora helping where Cora could help, which was more than you would expect from an 8-year-old. Because Cora had inherited something from her mother that was not exactly practical intelligence, but was related to it the ability to see what needed doing and do it without being asked, and without making a production of having done it. The Connecticut Commission arrived in November. Walter Crispin drove down with his dinghy on a trailer, a 16-foot lapstrake rowing boat of the same general type as the boat Nora had built. But this one was 30 years old and had been maintained with love, but not always with the right knowledge. And several of the oak frames had soft spots and 2 of the lower strakes had opened at the seams in ways that were past the reach of caulking. He had been told the repair would take 4 months and cost more than he expected. He seemed to already know this. He looked at the boathouse and at Nora's tool wall, the Matheson planes in their cases, the organized pegboard, the logbook still on the bench, and he said, "You trained with Joan Pease?" Nora said, "Yes." He said, "And you completed a Margaret Alden hull?" She said yes, and showed him photographs on her phone. He looked at them carefully. He said, "The upper strakes are not original." She said, "No." She explained the stock she'd sourced and how she'd matched the grain. He said, "That's the right stock. I know that mill." He left the dinghy. He came back in March, which was when she told him it would be ready, because she had learned from 3 weeks at Joan's school and from 7 months of working in the boathouse that deadlines were promises and promises were the structure of work, and she kept them. The dinghy was ready on the Tuesday of the 3rd week of March, which was within the week, she had told him. She had replaced 6 frames, replanked 2 full strakes and half a third, recaulked the entire hull, replaced the bronze gudgeons and pintles with new fittings from a supplier Constance had connected her to, and refinished the thwarts. The work had taken longer than she'd estimated in November, not because she had been slow, but because frame replacement in an old hull required the kind of patience that could not be scheduled. You had to wait for the wood to speak, and you could not make the wood speak faster. Walter Crispin arrived on a Thursday morning and spent an hour with the boat. He went over the new frames one by one, checking the fastenings, looking at the fit of the planking against the curve. He looked at the new strakes from outside the hull and from inside. He looked at the caulking. He said, "This is better than it was when I bought it." She said, "The frames I replaced are better stock than the originals." The originals were white oak, but cut from sapwood rather than heartwood. They'd have needed replacement in another 10 years anyway. He said, "I appreciate you telling me that." He paid her and shook her hand and said, "I'll send people to you." She went home and sat at the kitchen table on Whitmore Street and wrote in the ledger she'd been keeping since October, the record of income and expense against which she could measure whether this was working. She had done this carefully and honestly, the way Margaret Alden had kept her logbook, not to convince herself of anything, but to know the truth of it. The truth of it was not yet stable. She was not yet at the point where the work paid for the life, without the settlement money cushioning the gap. But she was closer than she'd been in November, and significantly closer than she'd been in the summer, and the trajectory was not ambiguous. She had 3 inquiry emails in her inbox from people Walter Crispin had apparently spoken to before he even got home from dropping off the dinghy. One was from a man in Rhode Island with a classic pulling boat that needed restoration. One was from a woman in Nova Scotia who had a lapstrake sailing dinghy with a cracked keel. One was from Joan Pease, who said she had a student who wanted to commission a boat and was looking for a builder, and had Nora thought about taking a commission for a new build. Nora replied to all 3 of them that evening. She told the Rhode Island man and the Nova Scotia woman she would have dates for them within the week. She told Joan yes, she had thought about it, and would be glad to discuss. Then she closed her laptop and went to Cora's room and looked in. Cora was asleep with the light still on and a library book on the pillow beside her. A book about sea turtles that she had chosen herself from the library's nonfiction shelf because, she had explained, she was interested in things that came from the ocean now. The orange walls held the lamplight and gave it back differently than white walls would have, warmer, softer, the color of late afternoon working its particular effect at 10 o'clock at night. Nora turned off the light. She stood in the dark doorway for a moment. The marine facility permit was approved in April. Gerald called to tell her on a Tuesday morning when she was in the boathouse working on the preliminary measurements for Walter's Rhode Island boat, which she'd agreed to take as her second commission. She pressed the phone to her ear with her shoulder and kept the measuring tape where it was because she didn't want to lose the measurement, and she said, "Thank you, Gerald," and he said, "Congratulations," and that was that. She allowed herself a moment to stand with the measuring tape in her hand and the licensed, permitted, legally operating marine workshop that had been a dilapidated boathouse behind a collapsed dock on a piece of land that the county assessed at 18 months ago. One moment. Then she went back to the measurement. In May, a woman named Caroline Rhodes found the dock by accident in almost the same way Nora had. She drove the wrong road and ended up at the chain-link gate, which was open now during working hours, and walked down to see what the sounds of sawing and planing were about. She stood at the bottom of the stone steps and watched through the open boathouse doors for a few minutes before Nora noticed her and came to the door. Caroline Rhodes was in her 40s, recently separated, and had driven from 3 towns over to look at the water because sometimes, she said, you needed to look at something that wasn't walls. She said this with the particular directness of a person who was too exhausted to be anything other than direct. Nora said, "I know." She invited her in. She made coffee on the small propane camp stove she kept on the workbench for exactly this purpose, because the mornings were cold and coffee was right for cold mornings, and she poured 2 cups, and they sat on the stone steps in the May morning and drank them and looked at the sound. Caroline said, "What is this place?" Nora said, "It was a ferry dock. A woman named Margaret Alden owned the boathouse. She built boats here for a long time, and then she died without finishing the one she was working on. I found it and finished it, and now I work here." Caroline said, "How did you find it?" Nora said, "I drove in the wrong direction." Caroline laughed. It came out slightly cracked, the way laughter came out when you hadn't done it in a while, but it was genuine. They sat for a while in the way that people who recognize something in each other sit, not needing to name it, just acknowledging by the fact of the sitting that the thing is there. Caroline came back the following week, and the week after. She started bringing her lunch and eating it on the stone steps while Nora worked, and they talked in the intervals and sometimes didn't talk, and this became, without either of them formally deciding it had become a thing, a regular part of the week. There was something about the stone steps and the open water and the sound of tools working inside the boathouse that made it easy to say true things. Nora had noticed this about the place, that it had an effect on people, a loosening of the careful management of how much you showed. She thought it might be something to do with the water, the way the sound just kept moving regardless of what was happening on the shore, keeping its own pace, its own indifference to human difficulty, which was not coldness, but was something that looked like perspective from the right angle. You could sit on those stone steps and feel, for the first time in a long time, that the thing you were going through was a thing and not the whole world, that it had edges, that it would eventually stop being the weather you lived inside and become something you had passed through. She had felt this herself, in the early weeks, before she had any reason for optimism, when all she had was the dock and the water and the cold and the fact that something here had been built right by someone who cared. She had felt it then, and she recognized it in Caroline now, the slight unwinding around the shoulders, the way the breath came differently on the steps than it had in the car, the returning habit of looking at things outside yourself. She did not name it. She just made coffee and let it work. Nora told her about Patricia Voss's lending circle. Caroline came to a meeting in June. By July, she had filed for a vendor's license to sell the preserves she had been making for herself and neighbors for years because someone finally told her they were worth selling. This was not nothing. Nora understood it to be not nothing. The way that finding a place to sit and look at the water could be the beginning of a direction. The way that sometimes what you needed was not advice or resources, but a place where what you were going through was understood by the walls and the water and the other person sitting beside you. Margaret Alden had built the boathouse as a place to work. Nora had come to understand it as also being something else, something she didn't have a specific word for, a place where the fact that you were still standing was not only sufficient but was, in fact, the exact right thing to be. In June, at the end of the school year, Cora did a project for her class about people in her community who did interesting work. She chose Nora. She interviewed her with a list of questions written in careful second-grade handwriting, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil, very serious about the process. She asked how Nora had learned to build boats, and whether it was hard, and what the hardest part was, and what happened when something went wrong. Nora answered each question honestly and at the right level of detail for a second grader's project. When Cora asked what was the best part, Nora thought for a moment. She said, "When you do a piece of work and it comes out right. When you put your hand on it, and you know." Cora wrote this down. She looked at what she'd written. She said, "Like the orange room." Nora said, "Exactly like the orange room." The project was presented to the class on a Friday. Cora came home and said Mrs. Park had asked if she could put it on the bulletin board in the hallway, which meant it would be outside the classroom for everyone to see. This was, in Cora's assessment, a significant honor. Nora said, "You should be proud." Cora said, "Are you proud?" Nora said, "I am completely proud." She meant it for the project and for the orange room and for the 8-year-old now, who had stood at the boathouse door on a June morning and put her hand on a cold hull and asked if she could help, and then oiled every tool case she could reach, and done it right without being told what right looked like. She meant it for all of it. For the whole year of it, from the gravel shoulder at the top of the ramp to this kitchen table on Whitmore Street in June, the distance between those 2 points measured not in miles, but in all the things that had been built in between. She had driven in the wrong direction and arrived somewhere she was supposed to be. Margaret Alden had built a boathouse and left it for whoever came next. A woman who was nobody's idea of a boat builder had walked down 11 stone steps and put her hand on cold wood and understood, not in words, but in the way the body sometimes understands before the words arrive, that this was hers to finish. She had finished it. She was finishing it still. The sound stretched out past the dock on summer mornings, patient and wide. The same water it had always been, keeping its own counsel. The boathouse doors stood open. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil and cut oak moved out on the air and was taken by the water and carried where the water went. She had built it right. She was building it right still. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.